On December 3, 1979, a demolition crew working on the old Fontainebleau Hotel Annex in Miami Beach broke through what they thought was a service corridor wall. Behind the plaster and lath, they found a sealed room. No windows, no ventilation grates. Just a single reinforced door that had been welded shut from the outside sometime in the early 1960s. When the crew finally cut through the steel, they discovered something that would remain classified in FBI files for the next 43 years. A nursery. 12 cribs arranged in a perfect circle. Above each crib, a brass nameplate engraved with a woman's first name and a date. Sarah, 1958, Rebecca, 1959, Leah, 1960. The names continued in careful chronological order, ending with Rachel, 1963. In the center of the circle sat a mahogany desk, and inside the desk's locked drawer, investigators found a leather-bound ledger. The pages contained meticulous records, menstrual cycles tracked to the day, ovulation windows calculated with scientific precision, conception dates marked with a small Star of David drawn in blue ink. Beside each successful conception, a single word had been written in Hebrew: Baruch, blessed. The final entry, dated November 22, 1963, the day President Kennedy was assassinated, read simply, "The covenant is complete. The line is pure. We are ghosts now. This is not a story about a gangster's depravity. This is not a story about sexual exploitation masquerading as organized crime. This is a story about a man who believed he was chosen by history to correct a genetic tragedy, who transformed 12 women into vessels for a theological mission, and who convinced an entire network of doctors, lawyers, and enforcers that they were participating in nothing less than the biological restoration of the Jewish people. This is a story about how faith, when weaponized by power and justified by trauma, can turn human beings into breeding stock and call it salvation. This is a story about Meyer Lansky's secret eugenics program, hidden in plain sight in the neon heart of Miami Beach, and the 12 showgirls who were told they had been selected to birth the future of Israel. Before we continue, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from. Which city? Which state? Which country? The story we're about to explore spans 3 decades, 4 continents, and reaches into some of the darkest corners of both organized crime and religious obsession. Your engagement helps us keep bringing these hidden histories to light. To understand how Meyer Lansky, the man the FBI called the most dangerous mobster in America, came to believe he could breed a master race of Jewish children in a Miami Beach hotel, we must go back to a winter morning in 1911, to a shtetl called Grodno, in what is now Belarus. Meyer Sucholyansky was 9 years old when the Cossacks came. The pogroms that swept through the Pale of Settlement that year were not random violence. They were systematic, ritualized erasure. Families were lined up in the town square. The Cossacks had a method. They would select the children first, the ones who looked most purely Jewish, dark-haired, dark-eyed, and they would kill them in front of their parents. The message was genetic. You are a contamination. Your bloodline is a disease. Meyer watched his younger brother Jacob dragged into the square. He watched the Cossack officer examine Jacob's face, his hair, his eyes, the way a farmer might inspect livestock. He watched his brother die because he looked too Jewish. And he watched his cousin, Samuel, a boy with lighter hair and green eyes, get passed over, spared because his features were ambiguous enough to grant him mercy. Meyer's family fled to New York 3 months later. They arrived at Ellis Island in the spring of 1911, and the immigration officer, unable to pronounce Sucholyansky, wrote down Lansky on the entry form. A new name for a new world. But Meyer carried Grodno with him. He carried the lesson the Cossacks had taught. that survival was a matter of blood, that the world judged Jews by their faces, their bodies, their genetic markers, and that the only way to protect the Jewish people was to control those markers, to perfect them, to breed a generation that could pass, that could survive, that could infiltrate and endure. By the time Meyer Lansky was 15 years old and running numbers for Arnold Rothstein on the Lower East Side, he had already begun to articulate a theory he would later call the Grodno Principle. He kept a journal written in Yiddish, hidden in the false bottom of a suitcase. The entries from 1917 and 1918 are chilling in their clarity. "The Goyim see us as vermin because we look like vermin to them," he wrote. "They see the bent backs, the crooked noses, the dark skin of the ghetto, and they see proof that we are less than human. But what if we could breed Jews who looked like them? What if we could create a generation of Jewish children with straight backs, with light eyes, with features so perfect that even the Cossacks would have to pause, not to hide, not to assimilate, but to survive, to infiltrate, to endure until we are strong enough to reclaim what is ours?" This was not idle philosophy. Lansky began studying. He read everything he could find on genetics, on eugenics, on selective breeding. In the 1920s and 30s, eugenics was not fringe science. It was mainstream, celebrated, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, and taught at Harvard and Stanford. Lansky attended lectures at the American Eugenics Society under a false name. He corresponded with researchers, posing as a philanthropist interested in improving human stock. He was particularly fascinated by the work of Charles Davenport, who ran the Eugenics Record Office in Cold Spring Harbor, New York. Davenport believed that complex human traits, intelligence, morality, even criminality, could be bred in or out of populations through careful selection. Lansky saw an opportunity. If the science could be used to justify the sterilization of the unfit, why couldn't it be used to cultivate the ideal? And who better to define the ideal than someone who had survived the pogroms, who understood what was at stake, who knew that the future of the Jewish people depended on their ability to adapt, to evolve, to become invisible until they were invincible. By 1935, Meyer Lansky was no longer just a bookkeeper for the mob. He was the architect of the National Crime Syndicate, the man who had turned organized crime into a corporation. He had money, he had power, and he had a plan. He began recruiting, not soldiers, not enforcers, doctors, geneticists, obstetricians. He found them in the same places he found his accountants and his lawyers, men who were brilliant, ambitious, and willing to bend the law if the price was right. Dr. Solomon Hirsch was the first. A Viennese-trained obstetrician who had fled the Nazis in 1938, Hirsch had published papers on optimizing reproductive outcomes that caught Lansky's attention. Lansky approached him in the spring of 1939 at a medical conference in New York. The pitch was simple. "I want to build the future of the Jewish people one child at a time. I need a man who understands the science and isn't afraid of the implications." Hirsch was skeptical at first, but Lansky was persuasive. He offered money, protection, and something more seductive than either: purpose. "The Nazis are trying to erase us by killing us," Lansky said. "We will defeat them by perfecting us." Hirsch signed on. Over the next 2 years, Lansky assembled a team. Dr. Miriam Stein, a geneticist who had been dismissed from Columbia University for her controversial theories on hereditary optimization. Dr. Benjamin Katz, a pediatrician who specialized in developmental enhancement, and a man known only as the archivist, whose real name has never been confirmed, but who was responsible for maintaining what Lansky called the registry, a database of Jewish families across America, cataloging physical traits, health histories, genetic markers. The registry was Lansky's obsession. He wanted to map the Jewish genome before the term genome even existed. He wanted to identify the ideal genetic combinations, the traits that would produce children who could survive in a hostile world. Children who were intelligent, resilient, beautiful in the way that granted social power. Children who could pass as Gentile if necessary, but who carried the covenant in their blood. The project needed a laboratory. Lansky chose Miami Beach. By the early 1950s, Miami had become his kingdom. He controlled the hotels, the casinos, the politicians. The Fontainebleau Hotel, which opened in 1954, was more than a resort. It was a fortress. Lansky owned a silent stake through a web of shell companies, and he had designed certain sections of the building with very specific purposes in mind. The sealed nursery the demolition crew would find 25 years later was built during the original construction. It was hidden behind a service corridor on the third floor, accessible only through a locked door disguised as a maintenance closet. The room was soundproofed, climate-controlled, and equipped with medical-grade ventilation. Lansky spared no expense. This was not a side project. This was his life's work. Now came the question of the women. Lansky needed 12. The number was not arbitrary. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 foundations of the New Jerusalem, 12 disciples. Lansky was not a religious man in the traditional sense. He rarely attended synagogue. He ate treif. He worked on the Sabbath, but he was deeply superstitious, and he believed in the power of symbolic numbers. 12 women would birth 12 bloodlines, and from those bloodlines, a new generation of Jews would emerge, strong enough to withstand the next pogrom, the next Holocaust, the next attempt at erasure. But these could not be just any women. Lansky had specific criteria. They had to be Jewish, but not too Jewish-looking. They had to be beautiful, but in a way that suggested health, vitality, genetic superiority. They had to be young, fertile, and critically, they had to be vulnerable. Women who could be controlled. Women who had no families to ask questions. Women who could disappear into the machinery of his empire and never be missed. He found them in the Showgirl circuit. Las Vegas, Havana, Miami Beach. These cities were full of young women who had come chasing the dream of stardom and found themselves trapped in the margins, dancing in second-tier clubs, sleeping with men who promised them breaks that never came, surviving on tips and hope. Lansky's recruiters were smooth. They posed as talent scouts, as producers, as managers. They offered contracts, real money, a chance to perform at the Fontainebleau, the most glamorous hotel in Miami. The women who accepted, and there were hundreds who auditioned, were subjected to what Lansky called the selection. It was presented as a standard audition, dance routines, vocal tests, interviews, but behind the scenes, Dr. Hirsch and his team were conducting a different kind of evaluation. Blood tests, genetic screenings, fertility assessments, psychological profiles. The women had no idea. They thought they were trying out for a chorus line. They were actually being cataloged, measured, and ranked according to their potential to produce what Lansky called the perfected child. By the spring of 1958, Lansky had made his selections, 12 women. Their names, the ones engraved on the brass nameplates in the nursery, were Sarah Rosen, Rebecca Stein, Leah Goldberg, Esther Weiss, Rachel Katz, Judith Abrams, Miriam Levy, Hannah Cohen, Deborah Friedman, Naomi Schwartz, Ruth Silverman, and Tamar Bloom. They ranged in age from 19 to 24. They came from New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Philadelphia. They were all Jewish, but their features varied. Some had dark hair and dark eyes. Others were lighter, with hazel eyes or auburn hair. This was intentional. Lansky wanted genetic diversity within a controlled framework. He wanted to test different combinations to see which traits produced the most optimal outcomes. The women were told they had been selected for an exclusive performance contract. They would live at the Fontainebleau, all expenses paid, and perform in a private revue for VIP guests. The pay was extraordinary, $500 a week, more than most showgirls made in a month. The catch, they were told, was secrecy. The review was for high-profile clients, celebrities, politicians, men who valued discretion. The women would live in a private wing of the hotel, and they were not to discuss the arrangement with anyone outside the program. Non-disclosure agreements were signed. Penalties for breach were severe. Legal action, financial ruin, and though this was never stated explicitly, physical consequences. Lansky's reputation was enough to ensure compliance. The women moved into the Fontainebleau in June of 1958. They were given adjoining suites on the third floor, luxurious accommodations with ocean views, room service, and access to the hotel's amenities. For the first few weeks, it seemed like a dream. They rehearsed dance numbers, attended fittings for elaborate costumes, and performed in what they believed were private shows for Lansky's associates. But slowly, subtly, the nature of the arrangement began to shift. Dr. Hirsch became a constant presence. He introduced himself as the company physician, responsible for ensuring the women's health and well-being. He scheduled regular checkups, blood work, gynecological exams, vitamin injections. The women were told this was standard for performers, that the physical demands of the review required close medical monitoring. Most of them accepted this without question. They were young, naive, and conditioned to defer to authority. But a few grew suspicious. Sarah Rosen, the first name on the list, began keeping a diary. Her entries from July 1958 reveal growing unease. Dr. Hirsch asked me again about my menstrual cycle. He wanted to know the exact dates, the flow, whether I experienced cramping. He said it was for a study on performer health, but something about the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. He touched my stomach during the exam, pressed down hard, and said, "Good, very good. You're perfect." I didn't know what he meant. In August of 1958, the women were introduced to what Lansky called the benefactors. These were men, wealthy, powerful, handsome, who attended the private reviews and afterward were invited to exclusive dinners with the performers. The women were encouraged to socialize, to charm, to flirt. Lansky framed it as networking, as an opportunity to make connections that could advance their careers. But the benefactors were not random guests. They were men Lansky had selected with the same care he had used to select the women. They were Jewish, but they looked Gentile. Tall, broad-shouldered, with light eyes and strong features. They were doctors, lawyers, businessmen, men with clean genetic histories, no hereditary diseases, no physical defects. They were, in Lansky's taxonomy, the seed. The women did not know this. They thought the benefactors were simply admirers, potential patrons. They did not know that every interaction was being orchestrated, that Dr. Hirsch was tracking their ovulation cycles and scheduling the dinners to coincide with their peak fertility windows. The first pregnancy was Sarah Rosen. In September of 1958, she missed her period. Dr. Hirsch confirmed the pregnancy with a blood test and told her immediately. Sarah was terrified. She was 21 years old, unmarried, and pregnant by a man she had met only 3 times. A man named David Stern, who had told her he was a real estate developer from New York. She wanted to terminate the pregnancy. Dr. Hirsch refused. He sat her down in his office, a small room adjacent to the sealed nursery. and explained the situation. "You have been chosen," he said, "for something far greater than a dance career. You are going to give birth to a child who will carry the future of our people. This is not an accident. This is destiny." Sarah tried to leave. She packed her bags and attempted to check out of the hotel. She was stopped at the lobby by two of Lansky's men. They were polite but firm. They escorted her back to her suite and told her that leaving was not an option. "Mr. Lansky has invested a great deal in you," one of them said. "You signed a contract. You will honor it." Sarah was not the only one. By the end of 1958, 3 of the 12 women were pregnant: Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah. The pattern was the same for each. They were introduced to a benefactor, encouraged to spend time with him, and within weeks, they were pregnant. Dr. Hirsch monitored the pregnancies with obsessive precision. He prescribed specific diets, vitamin regimens, exercise routines. He forbade alcohol, caffeine, and any medication not approved by him. The women were moved into the sealed nursery during their 3rd trimester. They were told this was for their safety, that the room was specially designed to provide optimal conditions for childbirth. The truth was that Lansky wanted complete control. He wanted to ensure that no outside doctors, no family members, no one who might ask questions, had access to the women or their children. The nursery became a maternity ward, a laboratory, and a prison. Sarah Rosen gave birth on May 14, 1959. It was a boy. Dr. Hirsch delivered the child himself, with the assistance of Dr. Stein and a nurse who had been brought in from Havana, a woman who spoke no English and asked no questions. Lansky was present for the birth. He stood in the corner of the room, silent, watching. When the baby was placed in Sarah's arms, Lansky approached. He looked at the child's face, examined his features, his eyes, his hair, and then he smiled. "Perfect," he said. "Absolutely perfect." He turned to Dr. Hirsch. "Record everything. I want measurements, photographs, genetic samples. This is the first. This is the proof." The baby was named Benjamin, after Lansky's father. Sarah was allowed to hold him for an hour, and then the child was taken from her. She was told that the baby would be cared for by a team of specialists, that she would see him regularly, but that for his safety and hers, it was best if he was kept in a separate part of the facility. Sarah never saw Benjamin again. 3 days after the birth, she was moved out of the nursery and back into her suite. She was given a new contract, a new role in the review, and a bonus of $10,000. She was also given a warning. If she ever spoke about the pregnancy, the birth, or the child, she would be killed. Not arrested, not sued, killed. Lansky did not make idle threats. The other women watched what happened to Sarah, and they understood. This was not a performance contract. This was a breeding program, and they were trapped. Some of them tried to resist. Rebecca Stein refused to eat, hoping to miscarry. Dr. Hirsch force-fed her through a tube. Leah Goldberg attempted suicide, swallowing a bottle of sleeping pills she had stolen from the hotel pharmacy. She was found in time, her stomach pumped, and she was placed under 24-hour surveillance. The message was clear. You will carry these children to term, you will give birth, and you will survive, because your bodies are not your own. They belong to the project. They belong to Meyer Lansky. They belong to the future of the Jewish people. Between 1959 and 1963, all 12 women gave birth. Some had 1 child, others had 2. In total, 17 children were born in the sealed nursery at the Fontainebleau Hotel. Lansky kept meticulous records. Each child was photographed, measured, and cataloged. Blood samples were taken and stored in a refrigerated vault. Genetic profiles were compiled. Lansky was looking for patterns, for traits that indicated success. Intelligence was measured through early developmental milestones. Physical appearance was assessed with a checklist: eye color, hair color, bone structure, skin tone. Temperament was evaluated through behavioral observations. The children who met Lansky's criteria were labeled Tier 1. The children who did not were labeled Tier 2. What happened to the Tier 2 children is not entirely clear. Some sources suggest they were placed for adoption through a network of Lansky-controlled agencies. Others suggest something darker. A former associate of Lansky's, speaking anonymously to the FBI in 1981, claimed that at least 3 children were removed from the program because they exhibited traits Lansky deemed undesirable. Removed was the word used. The associate did not elaborate. The women were not allowed to raise their children. After giving birth, they were separated from the infants within hours. They were told the children were being placed with families who could provide better lives, families who were part of Lansky's network, families who understood the importance of the mission. This was a lie. The children were not placed with families. They were raised in a facility Lansky had built in the Everglades, a compound hidden behind a front company called the Palmetto Youth Academy. The compound was staffed by doctors, nurses, and educators, all of whom had been vetted and paid by Lansky. The children were raised according to a strict curriculum designed to cultivate the traits Lansky valued: intelligence, physical fitness, linguistic ability, and above all, loyalty to the Jewish people. They were taught Hebrew, Yiddish, and English. They studied Jewish history, but not the history taught in synagogues. They studied the history of survival, of pogroms and expulsions, of the Holocaust, and of the need for a new kind of Jew, a Jew who could fight, who could infiltrate, who could endure. By 1963, Lansky believed the project was complete. 12 women had given birth to 17 children, and the genetic data had been collected. He had proven, at least to his own satisfaction, that it was possible to breed a generation of Jews who possessed the traits necessary for survival in a hostile world. But the world was changing. The FBI was closing in. Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, had made destroying the mob his personal crusade, and Meyer Lansky was at the top of his list. Lansky knew that if the FBI raided the Fontainebleau, if they found the nursery, the records, the women, the entire project would be exposed. He could not allow that. In November of 1963, Lansky made the decision to shut down the program. The women were released from their contracts. They were each given a lump sum payment, $50,000, and a final warning: forget everything. Forget the nursery. Forget the children. Forget Meyer Lansky. If you speak, you die. Most of the women took the money and disappeared. They changed their names, moved to different cities, and tried to rebuild their lives. A few tried to find their children. They hired private investigators, filed missing persons reports, contacted adoption agencies. They found nothing. The children had vanished into Lansky's network, their identities erased, their origins buried. The sealed nursery was welded shut on November 22, 1963, the same day President Kennedy was assassinated. Lansky himself supervised the work. He stood in the corridor and watched as 2 of his men used acetylene torches to seal the door. When the work was finished, he placed his hand on the hot metal and whispered a prayer in Yiddish. Then he walked away. The room remained sealed for 16 years until the demolition crew broke through the wall in 1979. By then, Meyer Lansky was living in exile in Israel, fighting extradition to the United States. He would die in Miami Beach in 1983 of lung cancer, surrounded by his family. He never spoke publicly about the nursery, the women, or the children. But in his final years, he told his grandson a story. He said that he had once tried to build something beautiful, something that would ensure the survival of the Jewish people, but that the world was not ready for it. They would have called it evil, he said, but it was love. It was the deepest love I have ever known. The FBI opened an investigation into the Fontainebleau nursery in 1980. They interviewed the demolition crew, examined the ledger, and traced the brass nameplates to a manufacturer in New York. They identified 8 of the 12 women. 6 agreed to speak, under condition of anonymity. Their testimonies were consistent. They had been recruited, impregnated, and forced to give birth as part of a program they did not fully understand. They described Dr. Hirsch, the benefactors, the sealed nursery, and the children they were never allowed to raise. The FBI attempted to locate the children. They searched adoption records, birth certificates, and hospital databases. They found nothing. The Palmetto Youth Academy had been dissolved in 1964, its records destroyed, its staff scattered. The children, if they were still alive, had been absorbed into the population, their origins hidden, their true identities unknown even to themselves. One of the women, identified in the FBI files only as Subject S, believed to be Sarah Rosen, provided a detail that haunted the investigators. She said that on the day she gave birth, Meyer Lansky had leaned over her hospital bed and whispered something in her ear. She could not remember his exact words, but she remembered the feeling. He was not threatening her. He was thanking her. He looked at me, she said, like I had given him the most precious gift in the world. And then he took my baby, and I never saw either of them again. The investigation was closed in 1985, classified as unresolved. The FBI concluded that while there was substantial evidence that Meyer Lansky had operated a coercive breeding program involving at least 12 women and 17 children, there was insufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges, primarily because Lansky was dead and the children could not be located. The case file was sealed and marked, "Do not catalog. Do not investigate further. Sensitive historical matter, classified by order of the director." But the story did not end there. In 1998, a man named Benjamin Stern walked into the FBI field office in Miami and claimed to be one of Lansky's children. He was 39 years old, a successful attorney, and he had recently undergone genetic testing as part of a medical screening. The results had revealed something unexpected. His mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited from the mother, matched a woman named Sarah Rosen, who had died in 1992 in Los Angeles under the name Sarah Brennan. Stern had hired a genealogist to trace his origins, and the trail had led him to the Fontainebleau nursery, to the FBI files, and to the realization that he was the product of Meyer Lansky's eugenics experiment. He wanted answers. He wanted to know who his father was, where his siblings were, and why he had been raised in a compound in the Everglades by people who told him his parents were dead. The FBI reopened the case. They conducted new interviews, re-examined the evidence, and attempted to locate the other children. They found 3. All of them had been raised in the Palmetto Youth Academy. All of them had been told they were orphans. All of them had been placed with families connected to Lansky's network after the compound closed. None of them had known the truth. The 4 individuals, Benjamin Stern and the 3 others, formed a support group. They called themselves the Covenant Children, a reference to the final entry in Lansky's ledger. They hired geneticists to analyze their DNA, hoping to identify their biological fathers, the benefactors. the results were inconclusive. The benefactors had been carefully selected to be genetically similar, and without samples from the Harem men themselves, it was impossible to make definitive matches. But the analysis did reveal something else. The 4 individuals shared certain genetic markers that were extremely rare in the general Jewish population. These markers were associated with traits Lansky had valued: high intelligence, physical resilience, and a specific combination of facial features that, in the language of the 1950s eugenics movement, were considered Aryan compatible. The geneticists concluded that Lansky's program had, in a limited sense, succeeded. He had produced children who possessed the traits he had sought. But at what cost? The Covenant children began searching for their siblings. They placed ads in newspapers, hired private investigators, and created a website. They received hundreds of responses, most of them from people who had been adopted in the 1960s and were searching for their birth parents. A few of the leads were promising. A woman in Chicago, born in 1961, had a birth certificate that listed her mother as unknown and her place of birth as Miami, Florida. Her adoptive parents had told her she had been placed through a private agency that no longer existed. She agreed to a DNA test. The results confirmed it. She was one of the 17. Her name, according to the brass nameplate in the nursery, was Judith. She had been born to Judith Abrams, one of the 12 women, and she had been labeled Tier 1 in Lansky's records. She was, by his criteria, perfect. As of today, 9 of the 17 children have been identified. The other 8 remain missing. Some may be dead. Others may be living under assumed identities, unaware of their origins. The Covenant children continue to search, but the trail grows colder with each passing year. The women who gave birth are all dead now. The last of them, Tamar Bloom, died in 2006 in a nursing home in Phoenix. She had never spoken publicly about the Fontainebleau nursery, but in her final days, she told her daughter a story. She said that she had once been part of something terrible, something that had been presented to her as a blessing, but had turned out to be a curse. She said that she had given birth to a child she was never allowed to hold, and that she had spent the rest of her life wondering if that child was happy, if that child was safe, if that child even knew she had existed. Her daughter asked her why she had never tried to find the child. Tamar looked at her and said, "Because I was afraid. Afraid of what I would find. Afraid that the child would hate me for giving him away. Afraid that Meyer Lansky's ghost would come for me if I broke my silence." She died 3 days later. The Palmetto Youth Academy compound still stands, though it is abandoned now, overtaken by the Everglades, the buildings slowly being reclaimed by the swamp. In 2003, a team of journalists from the Miami Herald gained access to the site. They found remnants of the program: desks arranged in rows, textbooks in Hebrew and Yiddish, a gymnasium with rusted equipment, and, in what appeared to be the headmaster's office, a photograph. It showed 12 children, ranging in age from toddlers to preteens, standing in a line. They were dressed in identical white clothing, and they were staring directly at the camera. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in Hebrew, "The first generation." May they be a light unto the nations. The journalists attempted to identify the children in the photograph by comparing them to the known Covenant children, but the image quality was too poor, and the children's faces too young to make definitive matches. The photograph is now held in the archives of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, catalogued under post-war Jewish history, controversial and unverified. Meyer Lansky's ledger, the one found in the sealed nursery, is also in the museum's archives. It has been studied by historians, geneticists, and ethicists. The consensus is that Lansky's program was a grotesque perversion of both science and faith, an attempt to apply the logic of eugenics, a logic that had been used to justify the Holocaust, to the survival of the Jewish people. But some scholars have argued that Lansky's motivations, however twisted, were rooted in a genuine trauma. He had witnessed the pogroms. He had seen his brother murdered for looking too Jewish. He had lived through an era when Jews were told, by both their enemies and by mainstream science, that they were genetically inferior. In that context, his obsession with breeding a superior generation of Jews can be understood, though not excused, as a response to existential terror. He believed that the only way to protect his people was to make them unrecognizable, to erase the physical markers that had made them targets, to create Jews who could survive in a world that wanted them dead. But the women he used to achieve this goal were not abstractions. They were not vessels. They were human beings, and they were violated. They were lied to, coerced, and imprisoned. They were forced to give birth and then robbed of their children. And the children themselves, what kind of life did they have? Raised in a compound, told they were special, told they were chosen, but never told the truth about who they were or where they came from. What does it do to a person to discover, at 39 years old, that your entire existence was the result of a gangster's eugenics experiment? That your mother was a showgirl who was forced to breed you like livestock? That your father was selected not because he loved your mother, but because his genes met a checklist? Benjamin Stern, the first of the Covenant children to come forward, has spent the last 25 years trying to answer that question. He has written a memoir, given lectures, and worked with therapists who specialize in trauma and identity. In an interview in 2015, he said this: "I used to think that the worst part of being one of Lansky's children was not knowing who I was. But I was wrong. The worst part is knowing exactly who I was supposed to be. I was supposed to be proof that Jews could be perfected, proof that we could breed our way out of persecution, proof that Meyer Lansky was a visionary and not a monster. But I am not proof of anything. I am a human being. I am a man who was born because my mother was raped by a system, and I have to live with that. Every day I have to live with that." The question that haunts the Covenant children, and that haunts anyone who studies this case, is whether Meyer Lansky believed he was doing something righteous. Did he see himself as a savior, a man who was willing to commit terrible acts in service of a greater good? Or did he know, on some level, that what he was doing was evil, and he simply did not care? The answer may lie in the final entry of his ledger, the one written on November 22nd, 1963. "The covenant is complete. The line is pure. We are ghosts now. The word ghosts is telling." Lansky knew that what he had created could not exist in the light. It had to be hidden, sealed away, erased from history. He knew that if the world ever found out, he would be condemned. But he did it anyway. He did it because he believed that survival justified any cost, that the future of the Jewish people was worth the suffering of 12 women and the stolen childhoods of 17 children. He did it because he had learned, in Grodno in 1911, that the world was a place where children were murdered for the crime of looking Jewish, and he had decided that the only way to win was to change the game, to breed Jews who did not look Jewish, to create a generation that could pass, that could infiltrate, that could endure. But what did he create? Not a master race, not a generation of super Jews. He created 17 human beings who have spent their lives trying to understand why they exist, who their parents were, and whether they were born out of love or out of a ledger. He created a legacy of trauma that has been passed down not through genes, but through silence, through secrets, through the weight of a history that was never supposed to be known. And he created a question that remains unanswered. Can you save a people by destroying the humanity of individuals? Can you preserve a bloodline by turning women into breeding stock and children into experiments? Can you call something a covenant when it was built on coercion, on lies, on the belief that some lives matter more than others? Meyer Lansky died believing he had succeeded. He died believing that somewhere out there, his children were thriving, that they were strong, intelligent, beautiful, and safe. He died believing that he had given the Jewish people a gift. But the women who were forced to birth that gift, and the children who were raised to embody it, they know the truth. They know that what Meyer Lansky built was not a covenant. It was a crime. And the fact that he committed that crime in the name of survival, in the name of faith, in the name of love, does not make it any less monstrous. It makes it more so. Because it shows how easily we can convince ourselves that the ends justify the means, that our trauma gives us the right to inflict trauma on others, that we can commit evil and call it righteousness as long as we believe, truly believe, that we are the chosen ones. The sealed nursery at the Fontainebleau Hotel was demolished in 1981. The site is now a parking lot. There is no plaque, no memorial, no acknowledgement that anything happened there. The 12 brass nameplates were placed in evidence storage and later lost during a transfer between FBI field offices. The ledger remains in the Holocaust Museum archives, but it is not on public display. The Covenant children continue to search for their siblings, but the search grows harder every year. The trail is cold. The witnesses are dead. The records have been destroyed. And the children themselves, the ones who have not been found, they are living their lives, unaware that they are part of a story that was never supposed to be told. In the end, this is not a story about whether Meyer Lansky's eugenics program succeeded or failed. It is a story about what happens when power, trauma, and faith collide, when a man decides that he has the right to play God, to engineer the future, to treat human beings as raw material for a vision only he can see. It is a story about 12 women who were told they were chosen, and who learned too late that being chosen is not the same as being free. It is a story about 17 children who were born to fulfill a prophecy they never asked for, and who have spent their lives trying to escape the shadow of a man who believed that love and coercion were the same thing, as long as the cause was just. And it is a story that asks a question we still have not answered. How many times will we allow ourselves to believe that we can perfect humanity through control, through selection, through the elimination of what we deem unworthy, before we admit that the only thing we are perfecting is our capacity for cruelty? How many more sealed nurseries will we build? How many more ledgers will we keep? How many more children will we create in the name of a future that never comes? Before we understand that the covenant we should be honoring is not the one written in blood and genes, but the one written in compassion, in consent, in the recognition that every human being, no matter how they were born, no matter what they were bred to be, deserves to be seen as more than proof, more than a project, more than a ghost. The truth, like the children themselves, remains missing. And maybe that is the point. Maybe some stories are not meant to have endings. Maybe some crimes are so vast, so intimate, so woven into the fabric of who we are and what we believe, that they can never be fully resolved. Maybe the only thing we can do is remember. Remember the women. Remember the children. Remember the man who thought he could save his people by stealing their humanity. And remember that every time we are tempted to believe that the ends justify the means, that our suffering gives us the right to inflict suffering, that we can call evil good as long as we call it love. We are building another nursery, sealing another door, and writing another ledger that our children will one day find, and they will ask us, as the covenant children are asking now. How could you? How could you believe this was right? How could you do this in our name?